Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the second day of the third South-South Forum on Sustainability. My name is Stephen Chen. I'm from this university,
Thanks.
from the Department of Cultural Studies. Welcome, especially to all of you who have traveled from various parts of the world to come to Hong Kong. Now, on this second day, we continue to have a lecture by Professor François Houtart, who is going to speak to us this morning until we hope 10:30 before the coffee break. The topic of his talk this morning is Latin America, popular movements, progressive governments, and present political crisis. Please join me in welcoming Professor Houtart.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction. As a matter of fact, because of the discussion of yesterday, which was extremely interesting, I'd like to make a few remarks, a few reflections. First, about the yesterday discussion on capitalism, on the present day situation. Yesterday we had some two main fundamental interventions, the one of Pedro and the one of, I forgot the name, which followed, of course. And we have, I think, I was impressed by two main issues. The first thing is what Pedro said: capitalism is a mode of production, first of all. And I think it is definitely true. This is the basis, and the basis of the reflection. But capitalism also is a mode of production with all the consequences on other issues than only the economic ones. I mean by that, and I will try to explain, the consequences from the social point of view, from the political point of view, from the cultural point of view, and from the ecological point of view. So I think that we have to start with the idea, fundamental idea, that capitalism is a mode of production, but with all the consequences of this mode of production. And the second idea that impressed me yesterday in the discussion was, of course, the present day situation and the predominance of financial capital. And that, of course, is really a very fundamental issue. Of course, we have heard about it. Pedro and the other companion have explained the mechanism which are playing to explain how financial capital has become the main orientation of the whole of the world economy. So now my problem was that in my first talk I spoke about post-neoliberal governments, and Pedro said no, we are not in a post-neoliberal period, and he showed how financial capitalism was organizing the world economy, and he called that a neoliberal situation, a neoliberal context, fundamental context. Of course, I agree 100% with what he said, but my problem is now how to call the progressive governments in Latin America. Perhaps it is just a question of vocabulary, how to call them. when I use the word post-neoliberal, I was thinking more to the organization of the policy. That means the reorganization of the state, like I said yesterday, with functions which were abolished by the neoliberal period in Latin America and in other continents also. That means the redistribution of wealth, the better access to public services by the poor section of the population, and more social investments. So that is a problem of how to call this period in Latin America, but I don't want to put the discussion on that for the moment. Perhaps later on we can come back on this. But I wanted just to say that I agree with the analysis of Pedro on the macro level and international level, but we have to find a way to express what has been the policy of the progressive governments in Latin America. This being said, I like to come back on three aspects. One is what Marx has called the equilibrium of metabolism. Sometimes it has been said that Marx was not aware of some aspects of reality, or did not give very much attention to some aspects of reality, especially the environmental question or the cultural question. And Marxism has been lacking from this point of view. And we have known in Latin America, from the point of view of culture, the work of Mariátegui, this Peruvian philosopher, sociologist, who introduced in a Marxist perspective the problem of indigenous people, in indigenous culture. But if we take the problem of environment, we find that there is a base in the writings of Marx, especially the first volume of Capital, where he is speaking about the problem of equilibrium of metabolism between human beings and nature. He explains very well, of course, that human beings are part of nature, but it is this part of nature which are not the human beings. And he says that one of the effects of capitalism is to destroy the equilibrium of metabolism. Metabolism is exchange of material between both. And he says one of the effects of capitalism is to destroy this equilibrium of material exchange between the activities of human beings and nature, and bringing a disequilibrium that he explains because of a difference of rhythm of reproduction. The rhythm of reproduction of nature and the rhythm of reproduction of capital. And he says that the difference are in the fact that capital reproduction is much more rapid as a rhythm than the rhythm of reproduction of nature. And because of this difference, and because of the fact that capital is imposing its rhythm of reproduction, there is a growing disequilibrium. And he says this disequilibrium can have very grave consequences in the future. Of course, he does not go further. He could not foresee what we are living today, especially on the climate transformation, etc. But at least I think there is there the basis of a fundamental thinking. And the conclusion of Marx was socialism is the only way to reconstruct the equilibrium between the equilibrium of metabolism between the activities of human beings and nature. Now, this thinking of Marx, which has not been developed by Marx himself, has been practically totally ignored by Marxist theory and by Marxist practice. By Marxist theory, because the theologians of Marxism have been more attracted, more interested by the problem of social relations of production. And by the praxis, that means the countries, the socialist countries, supposed to apply a Marxist theory, forgot totally this problem. And the socialist countries have continued to destroy nature, sometimes more than capitalism. I have somewhere a graph showing this matter for the history of Soviet Union. If I find it, I will give it to you. I did not find it this morning, but perhaps tomorrow. It's very impressive to see how the Soviet Union has destroyed nature, even sometimes more than capitalism. Why? Surely not because they were applying a Marxist view, because of this Marxist view on equilibrium of metabolism. Socialism was supposed to re-establish the equilibrium, but that has not been the case. And when we see the recent evolution of China, Vietnam, we see the same. The destruction of nature is tremendous. It is really a frightful situation to see how China has destroyed nature, has contaminated the water, under the water, subterranean water, for example, how the pollution of air, the air pollution, etc., etc. Now, of course, know that China is not aware of that, and I think the plans for the future are forcing a total change of actuation. But anyway, in between, the miraculous growth of China is paid precisely by a tremendous destruction of nature. So we can say that Marxism, neither from the theoretical point of view, the post-Marx, of course, thinking, neither from a theoretical point of view, neither from a practical point of view, has really applied this idea of Marx. And this idea of Marx is the theoretical base for what Hugo Chavez lately, at the end of his life, called eco-socialism. That means socialism taking into account the problem of environment. Now we can ask ourselves why? Why is that so? What was the reason? I think that a hypothesis can be brought about by the whole history of modernity. What is modernity? Modernity, which has, of course, I have no time now to go into details, but when we see the history of modernity from already the end of the 12th and the beginning of 13th century in Europe, the beginning of a modern age, and of course the famous century of light, I don't remember the name in English, the 16th century, and finally the industrialization process have been affected by a fundamental belief, a belief in modernity as a linear progress in a planet which is inexhaustible. And with this idea, the linear progress on a planet which is inexhaustible, we have had the concept of modernity and the concept of modernization of societies. And of course, this concept of modernity was absorbed by the logic of the capitalist system, of the economic system. And we have quite a few theories on that which we should, I think, take seriously. I mean, for example, the whole work of Karl Polanyi, this historian of capitalism, which lived in the States and in Canada and died about 50 years ago, but where he shows how capitalism has taken the economy out of society and finally imposed its own law to the rest of society. And for Polanyi, the idea is we have to reverse this situation and to bring back the economy as a part of the organization of society and not as the organizer of society. Or we can think about the famous Frankfurt School in Germany between the two wars, and in particular to Walter Benjamin, who had been also critics of modernity, showing how the capitalist logic has absorbed modernity. And I think that we can say that the socialist countries, from the Soviet Revolution to the Chinese one, have absorbed the concept of modernity on an acritical way, without criticizing the concept of modernity, which was, of course, absorbed by the capitalist logic. And that is perhaps one of the reasons, at least in the hypothesis we can try to develop, that is one of the reasons why the building of socialism has not been critical of modernity and has accepted the concept of modernity as a linear progress on an inexhaustible planet. And we have now in Latin America, because we speak about Latin America, an Ecuadorian writer, philosopher, who was influenced by the school, Frankfurt School, and his name is Bolívar Echeverría, who has written quite a few things about precisely the concept of modernity. And Álvaro García Linera, the vice president of Bolivia, one of the best intellectuals in Latin America, perhaps, has published in a series of books, a very big book of Bolívar Echeverría, which is called The Critics of Capitalist Modernity. And I think this book is a very important one, because it helps to understand how absorbing the context or how absorbing modernity, you absorb the fundamental principles of capitalism. And I think we can say what we can say about the socialist countries is also applicable to the progressive governments in Latin America. The fundamental idea is to modernize modernize societies, and not to transform them fundamentally, but to modernize. And a critical vision of modernization. So this view brings about, of course, the whole cultural aspect of precisely what is modernity. The fact that with a capitalist logic we have known not only a series of economic processes but also cultural processes, like what has been called also in some Latin American traditions now, the colonization of the minds, the colonization of the minds by the capitalist system, so that you bring about a certain concept of modernization, which of course goes together with the expansion of the logic of the capitalist system, and which is necessary for the reproduction of that logic. And this brings, of course, to very, very fundamental contradictions, which one day or another are exploding. So that is a first reflection about the problem of equilibrium of metabolism and the introduction of this dimension in the Marxist thinking, in the progressive thinking, in the socialist thinking. A second observation or reflection is about the use value and the exchange value. I know it is a complex issue and I am not competent from the economic point of view. But what is obvious is that for the capitalist system, the exchange value is the fundamental value. We can say almost to say the unique value. It's not of course that they don't take attention to a use value, but the use value is secondary to the exchange value. Because if you are not exchanging, you cannot have profits, and you cannot have a process of accumulation. So the exchange value is the fundamental issue for capitalism. And I think that this is, of course, this explains quite a bit of the present day orientations, why financial capital is taking such an importance, because precisely the exchange value is the fundamental one for capital accumulation. And of course, the fact that the exchange value is the fundamental one, and not the use value, changes everything. Everything. For example, there is much talk today in Latin America about extractivism. I saw yesterday the maps of petroleum and of mining in Latin America. And there is much criticism about extractivism because of the consequences, the environmental consequences and the social and cultural consequences. Of course, a person like Álvaro García Linera is trying to answer to that. And he said those criticisms about extractivism, which are criticism, of course, of modern governments, of present-day governments, and progressive governments also in Latin America, he says, why those criticisms? Because extractivism has always existed. The indigenous people were also extracting gold and silver from the earth. So why should we stop? But I think that is a false problem. The problem is to make the difference between extraction and extractivism. Extraction, of course, always existed. And we don't have to say that we have to stop to extract goods from the earth. But extractivism is when it became an exchange value and ceased to be first a use value. And then it enters in the logic of the capitalist system. And at that time, of course, there is all the consequences for the extraction of natural goods, natural resources, which are transformed in natural resources, because the names have an importance here. The difference between richness and resource. So at that time, of course, the whole conception of extraction has changed, and it becomes first of all an exchange value, and secondary only a use value. So at that time, the extractivism is a way of capitalist exploitation of the natural riches of the earth, and enter immediately in the capitalist logic. And that will be my third observation, which means concentration of power and the ignorance of externalities. But I will explain that just later on. When you privilege the exchange value, you change not only the problem of extraction, but you change the whole conception of organizing economy. I don't know if I can have some picture now. I would like to show a very interesting map. In the first, sorry, because from here it is so far away that I cannot see. Well, anyway, it is about international commerce. The map is a photograph from the satellite, and which has photographed, bringing several pictures together, the ships in the oceans. Every day, 22,000 ships of very high tons. I don't know how many or you call that tonnages, the great, many tons, of course, are circulating in the oceans of the world. 22,000 every day. And it is very interesting to see the satellite picture showing every point. A small white point is a ship. And you see, of course, all the great roads of the world transportation. But this transportation, about 60% of the whole world production goes about on the oceans. And that means that, of course, the utilization of a great number of course, of enormous energy, of energy sources. It means of course, the use, of course, of raw material to construct the boats. It means the pollution of the oceans, etc. And a great deal of this exchange, which is called, of course, the liberty, the liberalization of international commerce, is due to what Pedro said yesterday. Is due to the excuse me, due to the comparative advantages. It is transported because it is cheaper to produce in one place than to produce it in another place. And this is cheaper because, of course, labor is less paid, or environmental laws are not respected or not applied, etc. So there are comparative advantage. I will tomorrow, I think, give the example of the broccolis in Ecuador. Why is Ecuador producing broccolis? 97% of the broccolis of Ecuador are exported. And where are they exported? To the United States, to Europe, to Japan. Countries which can produce broccolis. So why is Ecuador exporting broccolis to countries which can produce broccolis? Well, just because of the comparative advantages. Because people are less paid. The labor is more exploited. Or because the environmental laws are not respected. We'll give the example in a very concrete way. So the same thing is true for many other aspects. I remember that in Europe, for example, now there were some campaigns in the supermarkets to indicate not only the price of the product, but the number of kilometers they have done between the producer and the consumer. And sometimes it is not only 1,000, but 5,000 or 10,000 kilometers. So this so-called rationality of the capitalist economy is turning in a total irrational way of organizing economy. And so we can give, I think, many other examples of the consequences of the domination of the exchange value on the use value. And finally, the last consideration is about the ignorance of externalities in the capitalist logic. Of course, yesterday we had very interesting informations about the concentration of power and decision power, this economic decision power in the capitalist system. I think a second aspect of the capitalist system is what we can call the ignorance of externalities. What is the meaning of that? Well, in this case, externalities there are different types of externalities. That means something which is external to the capital logic, to the logic of the market. And in our case, it is the damages, environmental damages and social damages. Why are they externalities? Because they are not paid by the capital. They are paid by nature, or they are paid by the people. The cost of externalities is not included in the calculation of the market. So they are external. So they are not important. They are just forgotten. And that has been the case, in particular, of the environmental damages. Because it is not paid by capital. It is not paid by the markets. It is paid by the damage, the nature, the natural damages. However, there is a certain, so there is no concern for externalities. And we have known that in the whole history of capitalist system. However, at one moment, you see some changes. Less than 10 years ago, capital began to be interested by environmental problems. Before that, it was a total ignorance. Ecology was the matter of people trying to save the butterflies, no? It was not taken seriously. But at once, just in a matter of few months, they all became green. They all painted themselves in green. And all you see, all the advertising in the papers, etc., even the most contaminating industries present themselves as green. They are contributing to the saving of nature. Why? Why this change? Well, I think it is very simple. Because the situation became so bad that it began to affect the benefit of capital and to affect the process of accumulation. So at that time it was no more only an externality. It was a part of the system. So they had to act. And that's why the capitalism became green capitalism. And you have seen that in international conference like Rio plus 20, just 2 or 3 years ago. I was there to the parallel meeting, and the very strange thing is that a great deal of the initiatives were under the patronage of big contaminating industries, Petrobras and Odebrecht, etc. They were paying, for the propaganda, I would say, of the green proposals. So when it began to affect the capitalist profit and the process of accumulation, then capitalism became green. And we have seen that in the Conference of Paris about the climate. At the end of the conference, there was some declaration of the of the big boss of Nestlé or Shell praising the results of the Conference of Paris, and they were praising it not because of preoccupation for the planet, but because the conference did not touch the fundamental issue of market-friendly solutions. The same thing is true, and that has been explained by Pedro yesterday, by what we could call social capitalism. Capitalism is not only green, but is also social. Why? But because of the social movements, which of course made a pressure. And of course the pressure of the social movements, of the workers' movement during the 19th and 20th century, later on, perhaps like today, more the peasant movement, etc., they put pressure on the capitalist system, and they are obliged to give some space to some social issues. But you see, in time of crisis, like in Europe today, of course, they profit of the crisis to recuperate a great deal of what had been achieved socially in the decades, the past decades, by the pressure of the social movements. So they decrease the minimum salary, they decrease the pensions, they decrease the expenses of health, they decrease the expenses of education, etc., in order to pay for the crisis. So the ignorance of externalities is a fundamental behavior of a logical behavior of capitalism. And because modernity has been absorbed by the logic of capitalism, the modernization projects that we have known in the socialist countries and also in the progressive governments of Latin America are absorbing also this idea, this ignorance of externalities to a great extent. So those are some of the considerations I wanted to make about the what has been said yesterday. I come back now to the topic indicated today. I will begin, and perhaps because we can continue tomorrow, there is no big problem in that, about popular movements, progressive governments, and political crisis in Latin America. Popular movements in Latin America are not new, of course. It is a long history. But if we take the present-day history, we have, of course, we can start with the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution, which has been, after a little while, a socialist, wanted to be a real socialist revolution, and has established a socialist regime in Cuba. Then we had, of course, the Allende in Chile. Yesterday there was some talk about that also. So those two factors, which were political factors but also social factors, have been very fundamental in the history of Latin America. I just remember what has been the present-day situation in Latin America with one illustration of the history of petroleum in Ecuador, the prices, the evolution of prices of petroleum in Ecuador. And I remember what I said yesterday, that there was a coincidence between the high price of commodities and the beginning of the progressive governments in Latin America, which has helped, of course, the progressive governments to have social policies and to expand social programs thanks to the revenue of petroleum. But that now we have known a sudden crisis, extremely important, which will affect, of course, all the different countries, the policies of the different countries, which were, of course, using this revenue of petroleum or mining or some agricultural product to finance their social policies. And you see the way that in Ecuador the price of oil is affecting, of course, the economy of the country. If I remember well, about 40% of the revenue of the state are depending from petroleum. Of course, in Venezuela it is even much more, as we will see. So that is the background, of course, of what will happen in Latin America. Now, we had, of course, the Cuban Revolution, which has been, of course, a point of reference for many other movements later on in Latin America. We have, of course, well, this is again one illustration of the problem of where we have the Latin American economies are facing today, and which will explain a part of the reaction of the social movements today. So we had the Cuban Revolution, we had the Allende regime, and then we have known, of course, many movements, armed movements in Central America. I mean Nicaragua, Salvador, Guatemala in particular, but also in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Colombia. Armed movement which were trying to go to a similar process as the Cuban process, trying to change a political power by armed movement. The only country where this has been a real success was, of course, Nicaragua. Later on, to a certain extent, Salvador. And this is still very important because it explains why in Nicaragua and Salvador you have a popular base of the political movement which is perhaps more solid than even in other countries because of the whole tradition of a long armed struggle. But in other countries, and especially in South America, we have known the development of social movement, not armed movement, but social movement. I mean, of course, some of the workers' movement in the countries like Brazil or Argentina, where industrialization has been more important, but also the peasant movements, like, for example, in Brazil, the MST, the movement of the landless peasant, which has been very important. Or the indigenous movement, like in Bolivia and Ecuador, or also to a certain extent in Guatemala, and of course in Mexico with the Zapatistas. So a lot of social movements have arisen after what I call, of course, the neoliberal period. That means a period of government totally at the service of the capitalist expansion in the capitalist system, and trying to to avoid, of course, what is called, what is thought in that logic as expenses, social expenses, and what has been viewed by the new governments as more an investment, a social investment. And so we have known during this time the different types of social movements, political revolutions, of armed struggles. Of course, the time of armed struggle for the moment in Latin America is, of course, is finished for the moment. I don't say that one day it is not a dogmatic affirmation. It is a factual affirmation that it is not through armed struggle that you can change the social situation in Latin America today, because of different factors. The fact also that a war is something very different today than just 50 years ago, and some other reasons also. So we are not in a moment of possibility of transformation of society with armed struggle, and we see, of course, what is happening in Colombia with the hope that the armed struggle will stop and a new way of transformation will come out. So we have known the importance of social movements against the dictatorship, political and social movements, and the birth of most of the new progressive governments in Latin America has come out of the social movements. If we take Brazil, if we take Nicaragua, if we take to a certain extent also, of course, Bolivia and Ecuador, it is different in Venezuela, as we will see. But anyway, the whole pressure of the social movement has had its political expression in new progressive governments in Latin America. If we take some examples, and I think I will finish with that, and I will continue tomorrow with the other aspects. Just take a few examples. In Nicaragua, the Sandinista front has been, of course, a coalition of different type of movements and trends, and this has been as a result the constitution of the Nicaragua Sandinista revolution, which has tried to reorganize society and to exercise a political power, which is, that is the picture not of Nicaragua, that is for tomorrow. I will give that tomorrow. But in Nicaragua, the Sandinista front has been the result of existing also social movements. Peasant movement, workers' movement to a certain extent, because Nicaragua had a very small working class, but also the Christian movements, the religious movements, the fact that Christian communities joined, of course, also and were a very active part of the struggle in Nicaragua, made, of course, that the regime which came out when the Nicaragua Sandinista front won the war, the armed struggle against Somoza and the dictatorship, made, of course, that the type of political system which came in was, of course, quite different as the Cuban one. It was an original way of organizing the political life. And it has been, anyway, it has been the result of the action of several types of social movement. If we take Venezuela, that is a completely different situation. Venezuela has been a society completely destroyed by the petroleum rent. The petroleum rent has provoked what has been called in some other countries the Dutch disease. The Dutch disease comes from the fact that in Holland they discover gas, and for a while a great deal of the economic activity was centered on gas, and they forgot the rest. And of course the Netherlands, the Holland economy is a strong economy, so they recuperate quite rapidly. But anyway, there was a certain disequilibrium because investments and all kinds of economic activities were centered on gas and no more on other aspects. But in Venezuela it was terrible because the whole activity was centered on petroleum. And for example, agriculture was practically abandoned. Venezuela has to import 70% of its food. And of course Venezuela is able to produce all the necessary food. But just agriculture was abandoned by the landlords who went to petroleum activities or petroleum rent, abandoned by the peasants who went to the cities and live also indirectly from the petroleum rent. The whole society was destroyed by the petroleum rent, but also the whole culture, the consuming culture, much more developed than in other countries of Latin America, a purely consuming culture, especially urban culture, but also corruption, because petroleum rent was the base for enormous corruption. And it became in Venezuela a kind of political culture. It is part of the political culture, the corruption. And Chavez has not been able to change that because it was a very fundamental cultural issue, and it takes time to transform that. So the whole Venezuelan society was really destroyed by the rent of petroleum. And of course, when Chavez came, when Chavez was military, the revolution in Venezuela came out of a military initiative. I remember the first time that I met Chavez was in San Salvador in a meeting of the Sao Paulo Forum. The Sao Paulo Forum is the meeting of the left parties of Latin America. And 20 years ago, just Chavez was coming out of prison. And he came to the forum and he wanted to speak, and there was some trouble there because Shafiq Handal, who was leading the meeting, did not allow Chavez to speak because he was not on the list. So there was quite an incident at that time. But I remember that the majority of the people did not know Chavez. And he had the image of being a military putschist. And so, of course, in the left movements, he was not really very well seen at that time. So he appeared, at least, to be just a military putschist like many others at the beginning. Of course, he had another idea, because Chavez was a man who had a very fundamental training. He was trained also in political sciences. He was not only a military. So he had a vision. And his vision came, of course, from the excess of neoliberalism and the Caracazo, the revolt of the people against the lack of food in Caracas in particular, and the fact that the army has served to kill the people who were protesting. And so a part of the army, of course, reacted against that. But at the beginning, of course, it was not understood. So when Chavez came, he had some ideas. But the idea of Chavez came from a military man, and tried to promote, of course, a popular reaction and organize a popular reaction. But it is very difficult to create a popular reaction and popular movement from the top, when the base was not existing or very little existing from the bottom. Social movements existed in Venezuela, but they had been destroyed very strongly by the different social democrat and Christian democrat governments which preceded precisely Hugo Chavez. And Chavez tried to reconstruct that, but it is very difficult. And Chavez used the rent of petroleum to try to reorganize society. And of course, the existing state was not the instrument to change society, because the existing state was made out of people very conservative, civil servants. Most of the ambassadors at the time of Chavez, when Chavez came into power, 2/3 of the ambassadors were of the opposition. So how to transform a society with a state which is of the opposition, you know? So what did Chavez do? He created a new state, a quasi-state with the missions. The missions for everything. Missions for primary education, secondary education, higher education, social economics, indigenous people, land reform, etc., etc. All kind of he created parallel state paid by the rent of petroleum. And of course, he had quite a bit of success in making that, to transform society and little by little to reconquest the state. But all those things are long processes. And that's why, of course, Venezuela is in a very fundamental crisis today, because of the diminishing price of commodity, and in particular of petroleum. So it is a drama for Venezuela. A drama, a very fundamental one, not just an accidental one. It is a very fundamental one. So that is a specificity of Venezuela. But Chavez had a vision, and a vision which was going much further than most of the other progressive countries in Latin America. Chavez had the vision of a real post-capitalist system. That's why he created ALBA with another philosophy. He had also the idea of bringing about more popular participation with the communes, organization of the communes, and that had a certain effect. He had also the idea of eco-socialism. I remember I was invited in Venezuela just a few months before the death of Chavez to make some conferences in Venezuela. And one was a discussion, a seminar with the guardians of public parks in Caracas. The guardians of public parks in Caracas on eco-socialism. Those people were very sensitive to nature because they were guarding the parks, but they were not very much socially conscious. So how to bring together the construction of socialism and the respect of nature. That was the preoccupation of Chavez. And I did not find that very much, of course, in some other leaders in Latin America. So the problem of Venezuela is really a problem of a long time, long run. And Venezuela was not able to transform the problem of the rent of petroleum as the base of its economic transformation. There are many other aspects also, but I will not enter into the details. And I finish with the example of Brazil. In Brazil, we have known, of course, the situation of Lula. And I remember a friend of mine who has been the secretary of Lula for many times, and he told me, to understand Lula, you must know that he is a trade union man. And as a trade union man from the car factories, he has two main values. First, efficiency. And second, social justice. And efficiency in the economic field is capitalism. Marx already said that. There is no more efficient system in the history of mankind to produce goods and services than capitalism. Of course, he said the price to be paid for that is terrible, because the price to be paid is the destruction of the two bases of the richness of capitalism, nature and labor. So for Lula, the efficiency is capitalism. And justice, social justice, is the distribution of a part of the surplus value to the poorest people. And I think it is very true, this vision. That has been the vision of the government of Lula and after that of Dilma. And true enough, like I said yesterday, 40 million people have gone out of poverty, and that is not nothing. It is a very important factor, a human factor also, and an economic factor. But at the same time, the situation of the richest people in Brazil has not been affected. And some of the sectors, like the financial sector and some others, never have made as much money as today. And the extractive sector has been extremely happy with the policies of Lula and of Dilma. I have visited in Brazil the famous mine Vale in the middle of Amazonia, where they have 600,000 hectares of concession, and where they are transforming nature in a lunar situation. Really extraordinary when you see that. But that is a multinational, but a Brazilian multinational. And in their website they write, we are happy to be in Brazil because they have mines in all the continents of the world. It is the second biggest mining enterprise in the world. And they said we are happy to be in Brazil because never in other parts of the world we have had better conditions for our enterprise than in Brazil, with specific tax exemptions, etc., etc. And in the year 2013, the enterprise has given more money to their shareholders than to the workers, to the people working. They have distributed more money to the shareholders than to the workers. So that is the Brazil not of the military. It is not the Brazil of Cardoso. It is the Brazil of Lula and Dilma. So that is the ambiguity of the project. And now when the crisis came, what has been the reaction? The reaction has been to go back to the market. Dilma, when she came to the United Nations last September, said the model that we have followed is exhausted. We have to think to another one. It is exhausted. And when she came back to Brazil, she said we have to develop more market-friendly policies. A return to the right, a return to more market-friendly policies. And that is a little bit what we see, I think, in all the countries of the progressive governments in Latin America. I will go further in that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So we see that the response to the crisis, which of course is bringing more and more difficulties for the model of redistribution of wealth, for the model of giving more access to public services to the poorest parts of the countries, etc. This model is more and more difficult, this experience is more and more difficult to hold. And the tendency, the trend, to try to solve the immediate problem is, of course, to go back to more market-friendly policies. That's what we see, I think, in quite a few of the countries today. I will stop here and continue tomorrow some of the reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, François. We have about 7-8 minutes left before the break, so I would like to have short comments or questions on this presentation. People?
If you allow me, I'd like to complement with some new developments. At least in Ecuador, you have at least 4 new type of social movements. Sorry if you, I'm repeating what you have said already. I have to get out Rafael. There are very rapidly. First, you have a new type of organization at the level of the neighborhoods. It's called the Comité de Usuarios, the neighborhood committees. We have 5,300 new committees that had deployed several tasks, but among one of them, I think one that is crucial for the future and the sustainability, the political and economic sustainability of the progressive governments everywhere. And that is the defense of the economic stability of the household. In Allende, it was the famous Juntas de Abastecimiento y Precio. How to neutralize the economic war of the oligarchy and the empire against the people, creating artificial scarcity and artificial inflation. In the case of Allende, that was one of the main components of the coup d'etat. In the case of Argentina, not with a left-wing government, a very centrist social democratic government, Alfonsín, that toppled the government and provoked an earlier change of government, democratically elected, but early succession. And in the case of Venezuela, they are spoiling the content and the nature of the transformative process. 4 years of economic war. Even toilet paper is scarce in Venezuela today. So it has a very damaging symbolic consequences in the conscience of the people. No, this is very important. So in the case of Ecuador, we had at least 2 episodes in which we could, with the comités de usuarios, we were able to stop the economic war against the people. The first one was in March 2015, and we went from 200 to 4,000 committees, and the second one was under the pretext of the recent earthquake. They tried to take advantage of that situation, creating scarcity and elevating the price. The second one is the creation of the productive assemblies. It is the organization of the local producers at the level of the counties, at the level of the provinces, in order to prepare the capabilities of the value chains, the social value chains at the local level, in order to transform the articulation with the state, with the so-called ecosystem, between quotes, ecosystem of innovation, science and technology, with the universities and the access to technology, with the credit system, and with the the capitalist corporate markets. I mentioned something about the possibilities of selling with the public procurements, the selling to the big supermarkets, the pharmacies, etc., etc. The third one is the organization, the specific organization of epistemic communities. We have created 95 citizens observatories, team by team. I mean, for example, out of the 95, 32 are the professionals of health. Physicians, pharmaceuticals, nurses, social workers, hospital, trade unions, small dispensaries all around the country that have constituted the national network of health. And they had a very interesting new type of mobilization, a new type of struggle, attending the specifics of their profession, of their own training, their own capability, but also organizing the discussion about new types of problems, to problematize, to politicize a lot of issues that were assumed as technical, and therefore outside the realm of political discussion, outside of the realm of citizens' control. And the fourth of them is related to this, is the fight against corruption. With this national network of health, we presented a system of citizens' oversight over the public procurement for the medicines for the next 3 years of the whole public sector. And we, from the design of the auction, we presented a permanent vigilance of the different professional bodies, reducing the cost of the auction. But once the budget was set up in $600 million, you must take into account the size of the Ecuadorian economy. That is the most important public procurement operation for years. Once you set up this budget for $650 million for the purchase of medicines for the next 3 years, you had already a reduction in the price. But once we implemented the auction, we have a reduction of $300 million, more than 60% of savings, with a direct participation of the people around corruption things that usually are one of the banners of the right, saying that everybody that is progressive is by nature dishonest. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the comment. Okay.
I think Ruth just gave the very concrete examples of what has been done in Ecuador. And I know, Francois, you have been to so many of these countries, but could you give some kind of assessment of what has been done about the indigenous in Bolivia, and also what is your assessment of the Zapatistas? I know you've been to exchanges with them so often.
Of course, Bolivia is a very specific society where the indigenous people are majority. And Evo Morales is an Aymara, one of the most important, of course, group, the ethnic group in Bolivia. But there are some others. They are the Guaranis, they are all the Quechua, etc. And Evo Morales was a local leader. I remember I had some contacts with him. The first contacts I got with him was when he was a local leader in Chapare, is a region of Bolivia near Cochabamba, where he has been very active as a local leader, indigenous leader. So, of course, the indigenous question has been very central in the whole process of Bolivia, and that is the specificity of Bolivia. Of course, it is a complex matter also because of the different ethnical groups in Bolivia. And some of the groups which are not Aymara are even claiming that there is a certain exclusive policies against the non-Aymara groups. I don't know enough of Bolivia for the moment to say if it is correct or not. But at least I saw, for example, I had meetings with the leaders of the Guarani movement, and they claimed that the Aymara people in Bolivia were taking over their properties and their territories. Perhaps it is true, perhaps it is not so true, I don't know. But anyway, it is complex because it is not only one reality, it is a complex reality. But anyway, at least from the symbolic point of view, the fact that Evo Morales is the head of the country is an extraordinary transformation, because the mood and the cultural attitude toward the indigenous people was, of course, a very from the part of the white people, or the white, there are not so many white people, but there are some, especially among the landlords of the Santa Cruz and all this region. Some are recent European immigrants after the Second World War. But as a whole, in the whole history of Bolivia since independence, of course, the mestizo attitude against the indigenous has been, of course, extremely poor, extremely bad, I would say. So this transformation of having someone coming from the indigenous movement as the head of state is really a very, very fundamental change. Now, this goes together, of course, with other aspects of politics. The economic aspects, the problem of extraction, the mining problem, the problem of petroleum, of gas, etc., the problem of lithium now from this new product, very important for electricity, cars and things like that for the future. All this is, of course, quite separate from the indigenous question. And in this sense, we have some policies which are very much discussed for the moment in Bolivia. Some people thinking that Bolivia could have had another policy, less depending of the multinationals, less also depending of the new agreement with the landlords of the Santa Cruz region, and more independent from an international point of view all this is now into question. It is very, very strongly discussed for the moment in Bolivia. So, so the two problems of indigenous power from one point of view and the type of economic orientation from the other point of view are parallel questions and not always related. But I just can conclude that from the symbolic point of view, it is a very fundamental change.
Thank you. Do we have one last question before the coffee break? Okay.
You mentioned Venezuela abandoned its agriculture and how they try to restore it, regenerate agriculture in Venezuela. Are there any social movement trying to do this?
To do what?
To regenerate agriculture in Venezuela.
Yes. Yes, of course. Of course, the government has tried, of course, land reform. But the problem is that when you have abandoned agriculture, especially here I speak about peasant agriculture. When you have abandoned peasant agriculture, it is extremely difficult to rebuild it because you lose the know-how. And of course the people who have been going to the cities are not ready to go back to the land. You know? The same thing in Cuba. Cuba is also importing 60–70% of its food from outside because of the destruction of peasant agriculture for other reasons, not for petroleum rent, but it was for the monoculture of sugar, which has been reproduced in the socialist system because Cuba, in the Comecon, was supposed to produce sugar for the rest of the socialist countries, you see, of Europe in particular. So the first plan of the Che Guevara was to transform the economy of Cuba and have another kind of multiple kind of production in Cuba. But that has been practically stopped by the Comecon, where Cuba has been obliged to continue to produce sugar. So there was little tradition of peasant agriculture in Cuba. And also the success of the revolution, which makes that most of the people have gone through not only secondary education, but also 1 or 2 or 3 years of post-secondary education, makes that those people don't go back to the land, you know. So it's very difficult for Cuba to transform and to, of course, there was also the political economy, which was so strict, nationalized, so little, with very little possibility of doing things in Cuba from the economic point of view because of a conception of nationalization of economy, very, very centralized. All those factors played a role for the situation of Cuba. But it is very difficult to come back to a peasant agriculture. So the government of Venezuela has tried to do that, is trying to do that, but it is a very, very slow process.
Okay, thank you.